This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Dru Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the visiting professor at Hope College in Michigan, as well as the co-host of the On Script podcast. He has written numerous books, including the brand new What Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture, out now on IVP Press. We will be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Johnson, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really looking forward to talking to you today, but before we get into the book, tell us about yourself, your background, and your work.
Well, I came to academics later in life. I was in the military 7 years. Then I went into IT, did seminary, worked as a pastor for about 8 years. And then in my mid 30s, felt called to go do higher education. And so, we moved to Scotland and did a PhD there. And then I've been working at King's College, for the last 13 years until it closed, last year. So I'm not a classic academic. I didn't do the undergrad to graduate school to working as a professor, which I'm glad I didn't, because I would not have been good in the position if I had done that.
Yeah, I get it. Well, your brand new book is called What Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture? And I think that this is one of, by far, the most interesting books that I've read in a very long time. What motivated you to write this book?
It was really crass. I was so dissatisfied with all the conversations about theistic evolution and creation and people trying to work out where evolutionary thought and Christianity as it is, where they rub and where there's conflict. And I felt like everybody was looking past what was obvious, which is the biblical authors have their own conversation about the very topics of evolution, or at least natural selection. And so I was just like, hey, it's like the biblical authors were over here jumping up and down going, hey, we have something to say here, and nobody's really listening to us. So I'm always one that wants to listen more closely to what the biblical authors are talking about. And so I just, in faith, when on my sabbatical, I was like, I bet there's more going on here than we think. And so I just took it on, and I was even surprised how much more there was going on in Scripture on the topics of natural selection than I probably would have ever imagined. So.
And I think a lot of people would not think, again, a lot of this has to do with the creation and evolution debates that have been raging for a very long time, but a lot of people would just assume that there's no conceptual overlap between natural selection and the Scripture. But the burden of your book is to show that, in fact, there are a lot of overarching themes that do correspond with biblical concerns. So before we talk about the book, I think there's some important background information that people might need to know. Of course, most of my audience will be familiar with Charles Darwin, but there might be some who have only heard of him in passing. So I think maybe we should talk about Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection. And then, of course, from his theory of natural selection, there are three major concerns that arise from that theory that you're going to address in your book. So walk us through that. Who's Charles Darwin? What's his theory of natural selection?
Yeah, so Darwin, and he does have a colleague named Wallace, who is not his direct colleague, but it's somebody who actually came to very similar conclusions simultaneously as Darwin. Darwin just got famous. He was in the right place at the right time. He actually studied to be a minister out of Cambridge, and ended up going on a long voyage on the HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's Service Beagle. It goes lots of places, but the one that he's most famous for ends up on the west coast of South America and the Galapagos Islands, and he's creating taxonomies of the creatures that he's finding. He's observing creation very closely, and he's just noticing things. And so I would say, the one thing that we should be very thankful for about Charles Darwin's work is he's very attentive to what is actually going on in creation. And he's trying to piece it together. Like how do we explain these anomalies, these things that don't make sense? You go from little island to little island to little island that are very close together, and the same birds have different shaped beaks on each island. Like, that's just a puzzle. Like, anybody who saw that and noticed it would be like, I wonder why that is, right? So he tries to work out this kind of is the famous story of how we enter his thinking. But that's one of the problems that he's trying to work out is, how do we explain the diversity of biological life and especially when the diversity of biological life seems to fit the different locations. So it's important that the beagle comes all the way down the east coast of South America and comes around the Horn and comes around the west coast of South America, because he's seen all of these different creatures in these different locales, and he notices they are very different from one another, but that they also seem to fit their location very well. So you can imagine all this is percolating. He eventually ends up thinking of it in terms of selection. How do different animals breed with each other? Like, which males make it into the competitive pool of breeding? You could think of all farmers from the beginning of history have done something similar. Like, which males do we breed with our females to make the best cows, goats, sheep, etc.? So there's nothing new here. Gregor Mendel does it with peas and genetics, right? How do we mix the right crops together as well? So he begins kind of, and I don't know the intellectual history of Darwin and all of its details, but all of these ideas are percolating in his mind. And at some point, he sees them fomenting into one, three-corded strand interconnected together, which he writes in The Origins of Species, which goes through very many revisions. I think the 6th revision, I think it's got at least 6 revisions. And essentially, it's this. He thinks that the way that animals get selected is based upon there's some kind of scarcity or climatological pressure. Either it's too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, or there's not enough food. And so animals have to compete, and the ones that compete best are the ones that are going to be the ones best fitted to that environment. So if you have 2 males of the same species and one of them has a slight genetic advantage, he wouldn't know about genetics at this point, but if they have one slight advantage towards the dampness of that climate, the damp, loving male might be the one that wins in the competition for food. He's going to go on to mate, and his genes are going to get passed along between him and a female. And so you get that fit to environment, that scarcity that creates competition, and then that equals who's going to have their genes propagated out into the next generation of iguanas or birds or whatever. And those, so he calls or I don't know if he calls them that, but they're the 3 pressures of natural selection. It's worth pointing out that natural selection is not evolution. Natural selection is one process embedded in evolutionary thinking. But we often conflate those together. We just say, oh, Darwin and evolution. Well, Darwin wasn't an evolutionist in any way that anybody today is an evolutionist, or has an evolutionary scientist at least. So, the science, some parts of evolutionary science reject aspects of Darwin's thought, right? So one key aspect that is up for debate now is it all about competition? Does scarcity necessarily breed competition, or can it breed cooperation, right? That's a big question. There's also larger issues that scientists have studied in gene flow and gene drift, which all come from areas of genetic studies, population studies, et cetera. So even today, if you're going to a department of evolutionary biology today, they're not going to necessarily say Darwin's version of natural selection is the thing that drives evolution. They actually think there's much more going on to that. So I always start with Darwin, what he thought, and then kind of how the conversation has, trying not to say evolved, but how the conversation has developed over the last century and a half, since the mid 1800s when he's writing.
And again, as we were saying before, there are a lot of people that think that entire conversation has nothing to do with the narrative of the Bible. And I think it's even in the subtitle of your book, you talk about how we have to understand the Bible in its own conceptual world. Mm-hmm. I think that in your book, you do an excellent job of understanding that entire idea. But there are a lot of people that really struggle with what it means that the Bible was written in an environment that was just intellectually fundamentally different than our own. So talk to us a little bit about that idea of the conceptual world of the writers of Scripture and how that might differ from our own conceptual world.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for picking up on that, because for me, that's the key, the core of the book. In some ways, it was my great fear that the evolution creation debate, it kind of is the distracting feature. I really want people to pay attention to what's going on in the conceptual world of Scripture. And of course, Scripture is written over many centuries and maybe even millennia. And so its conceptual world does develop over time, but it has its own way of thinking about the nature of reality, the nature of physics, the laws of physics, ethics, justice, etc. And I hate to say it for Americans, for those who are listening who are Americans, a lot of the American cultural ideals about these topics don't always line up one for one, or even two for one, or even side by side with some of these, right? So there is a critical, cutting conversation on lots of things that we would care about. And I could give one simple one. In the American justice system, we think about crime and punishment. I mean, that's essentially all we think about. Is law is there to restrict behavior. This is a libertarian podcast, right? So we can talk about the law is there to restrict behavior. Anything that's not restricted is typically permissive. But we only use law to restrict behavior. And we think of law as in you either break it or keep it. Those are the primary metaphors we use. And then if you break the law, you can get fined, you can get arrested, detained, imprisoned, incarcerated, etc. So the biblical system of justice has no incarceration. It does have punishments, but actually its punishments usually try to restore a person to the community rather than take them away and put them somewhere else. And they're surrounded by cultures and empires that have massive industrial jailing complexes. So it's not like they're not familiar with those. So even in their own day, you have empires that think about citizenry and punishment and crime in similar ways to the way the Bible does, but then they have these harsh punishments that are very that basically cut the world up by classes. So if you're a lower class and you do something to an upper class person, your punishment is much greater. All the inequalities that we see in societies today. Well, the biblical authors actually have their own system of justice that has no real incarceration built into it. It defeats classism, so it's very much every man and every woman are equal to each other as citizens. It openly welcomes foreigners, which again would be unheard of in the ancient world. Foreigners are suspect; they're problematic. They're actually potential insurrectionists. And yet the Hebrew Bible is like, no, love the foreigner as you love yourself. Welcome them in. As long as they play ball, then bring them on in. So they just have this very different way of thinking about the world, even from their own contemporary people in the ancient Near East. And it's not just they have a different way of thinking about it. When you read across that literature, they are portraying to you, this is how we believe people should think about the world. So anything from simple ideas like all humans are created equal to each other, which you do not get from because we're created in the image of God. Image of God is like the start of that conversation. But people enslaved other people because they believe they're created in the image of God. That doesn't guarantee anything. And so even things like science, I mean, I don't want to make too big of a deal of it, but you can't do, like conceptually, you have to have a conceptual world available to you that you can think scientifically. There's these kind of movies where they portray people time traveling. And if people come into the present and they see what scientists do, they would call it witchcraft, right? So you have to have a conceptual world available to you that allows you to understand like a critical interaction with reality in a particular way, believing in laws and uniformity of nature. And there's all kinds of concepts that you have to have present to you in order for the modern practices of science to exist. And I don't write this so much in the book, but it's really hard to find the conceptual world that science needs to operate anywhere outside of the Hebrew Bible. I mean, the Hebrew Bible really the Greeks and Romans do not give you the conceptual basis for doing science. In fact, science is in many ways a long history of dropping off Greek theology and Roman theology in order to return to something more critically real, like what the Hebrews are telling you about. So that's what I mean by conceptual world. Do they have their own concepts about things? And if so, how do they tell you about them? They often tell us about them through narrative, poetry, and legal reasoning. And those are the three main, they're not the only kind, but those are the three ways they reason with us about the nature of reality. And they really do want us to believe that their story is maybe not the only right story, but it's a good enough story and better than any of their peers.
Well, the three concepts that have arisen out of Darwin's theory of natural selection, as you said, are scarcity, fit, and then generation. And in your book, you tackle all three of those in sections in that order. So I kind of want to go over those in the order that you present them in your book. And it makes sense logically once you get to the end of your argument at the book. So let's start with scarcity here. What does Darwin mean by scarcity? And you also talk about how, again, Charles Darwin was writing 170 years ago or something like that. And so subsequent, evolutionists interest, and people that have taken up Darwinian theory have modified and changed and adapted and improved on a lot of Darwin's ideas. So what does Darwin mean by scarcity, and how has that idea been developed by people that follow Darwinian thought?
Yeah, so scarcity is pretty simple. It just means there's not enough food. It could also mean there's not enough of a particular kind of environment. You just think about think about at the beginning of COVID, people in Target fighting over something. They're fighting over toilet paper, which just blows my mind that was happening. But it's just there wasn't enough. And now it's the pie is so big, and now we're just dividing them. We're not talking about enlarging the pie. We're just talking about dividing the pie. And so who's going to be able to best fight for those resources? Now, the critique that actually comes very quickly. I mean, even by the 1930s, you have people critiquing Darwin, calling it the Darwinistic fallacy, that competition and violence are the natural outcome of scarcity. They'll say, of course, in the later feminist critique will say, yes, well, men wrote all these theories. And so, of course, men think that violence is the natural outcome, that you have to fight to the death for scarcity, right? But it's, in some ways, it's just like Rousseau's story, two men in the woods, savage men that look at each other and they say, I could kill the other one, which is fine. They can go about their way. They make a little social contract that they're not going to do that until there's not enough food. And then they have to actually start thinking about, can I take this guy? Can I get the food? And so he just thinks that at every microcosm and every niche where animals find themselves, that there's always going to be either scarcity of food or some kind of climate issue that's going to be like the sifter that determines who lives and who dies. And there's another one in there as well that Darwin just states, and he also notes that everybody has a problem with it, and that is female preference also fits in here as well. That females pick certain males to mate with when they can, because in most species, females are bigger than males. And so they get to choose because they're bigger and stronger. So they get to choose which men that they're going to mate with. And so they seem to have, in many species, they seem to have odd preferences. And most of the preferences tend to get men killed. So if you're a bird, having really long, colorful feathers is not going to help you escape, predators. But that might be the very thing that females have a preference for, right? So there are kind of things like uncontrollable things. I guess they're all uncontrollable, like climate or lack of food. And then you also have this weirdly uncontrollable thing if you're a male, which is whatever that female bird likes on me, whatever that is, if I don't fit it, then I don't get it. That's just the way it goes. So.
Yeah. And before we talk about how that concept of scarcity overlaps with the Bible, you do make a very important qualification in your book. And that qualification is that the Bible understands, or the writers of the Bible understand nature in a very different way than we do in the modern world. So I think before we can understand how the biblical writers developed the concept of scarcity, talk to us about that difference between our kind of like post-Enlightenment understanding of nature and the ancient conception of nature that was present in the Hebrew scriptures.
Yeah, that's a very important point. We have lots of ideas about nature. What is natural? I mean, Lord Tennyson's saying nature red in tooth and claw, right? It's just kind of this dispassionate existing stuff that doesn't really have a will, agency, or direction to it that's necessarily ethical in any way. Ironically, we shade that with all other kinds of other ideas about. So we talk about Mother Nature, and we talk about. I mean, we don't call it Father Nature; we call it Mother Nature, and so we're appealing to certain aspects of nature in that metaphor or that analogy. So I think what you see in the biblical text, kind of a presumption that you find throughout, which is that nature is creation. We say creation because we talk about there are things that are created, and there's the things that create. Those are two categories that you find in Scripture. There's only one thing in the creator category, and that's God. And then everything else is in the creation category. So you still do get that kind of like, creation doesn't have necessarily a will, agency, or like an ethical direction to it. In some sense, there are other senses where it does. Creation is just creation. But it is good and important and significant because of our relationship to creation, our relationship to God, and God's relationship to creation. He created it. He created us from creation. Man was not man is a created thing, but he's also taken from, he's called the dirtling who's taken from the dirt, right? So everybody comes from creation. Animals are dirtling. They're made from the dirt and have the breath of life just like the man does. So there's all this connectedness between humans and creation, and therefore humans and God. And anything that happens, God is part of that causal network, right? So if a tornado happens, God is somehow part of the causal network in which it might not be direct where God sent that tornado. It might be God allows winds to become turbulent enough to where they become tornadic and, they tear things apart. And so the view of nature that you start off with in the early text in Genesis 1 and 2, it's very short. You don't get very much of it. Is there is a way that the world exists that's different than the way the world exists now. Now, the word we typically use is metaphysics, but again, there's so many definitions of metaphysics. I mean, who knows what to do with that word? But it means something like this, and this is the best illustration I've ever heard, which is cancer cells are just human body cells that turn against the body and convince other cells to do the same thing through, I don't know what the networks are of how they talk to each other, but cancer cells are not like some cell called cancer that comes from outside the body. It just turns against the body. So, which means there is a way that humans can exist where their cells do not turn against them. Their cells work cooperatively in the favor of the human body at all times and all places. And so the biblical authors seem to imagine a world in the beginning where everything from trees to dirt to human relationships to the human body itself, it all works in the right direction. Everything is beneficent towards the goals to which they were created. After Eden, east of Eden, the dirt is cursed. The dirt turns. The woman's body turns against herself. The curses are very direct. Her body turns against itself. Her fertility turns against itself. The dirt turns against the man and the woman, presumably as well. Things are disoriented in some way. And then and you keep on chugging. It doesn't, like the prophets don't believe it's going to stay that way forever. They envision a world with the reunion of the heavens and the earth where things are going to be reoriented again to the way they're supposed to be. And, in the New Testament, they'll call that the new heavens and new earth, or the heavens, or the age of resurrection. They have lots of different titles for it. But they all seem to be referring to the same thing. So in the book, I use the as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall evermore shall be. I use that as kind of I twist that phrase to give what the biblical authors seem to think, which is the way the universe used to exist one way, no longer exists that way right now, but will one day return to that properly oriented state of existence. Tom Wright, or N.T. Wright, calls this putting the world to rights, is his phrase that he uses. But it's referring to that, like, reorienting of all the same matter, all the same stuff is still here. It just is not cancerous and corrupted and bent and warped and warped and etc. Yeah.
Yeah, that is perfect. That is perfect. Now, you spend 2 chapters in your book looking at how scarcity unfolds throughout the Old Testament. You have an entire chapter on Genesis, and then you deal with the rest of the Old Testament in a subsequent chapter. And it's very apparent when you present it in the way that you do that is a massive theme. So walk us through that. How do the writers of the Bible, given their conception of nature is a little bit different than ours, how do they understand scarcity, and how does that intersect with the way that Darwinian theory has understood scarcity?
Yeah. So, and I will admit, I knew it was there. I did not know how prevalent it was until you take that one question and you start looking through, and you're like, oh, here they are again, talking about it again. So again, the curse of the garden, it is not. It's not necessarily death in the conventional way. It really is that the world turns against you. Everything turns against you in some way. So the fact that the dirt is cursed means that food is going to be scarce, difficult to find. And you see that with Cain, who, the next generation, he's a slave to the dirt, and he's offering up sacrifices. But it's, again, this kind of, and he gets cursed because he murders his brother. Notice it's not capital punishment there. It's actually just a curse. He gets cursed to wander, which means he can't do the thing that he knows how to do, which is work crops out of the ground. And the dirt is doubly cursed against him again, right? So God keeps on returning to this cursing of the dirt. By the time you get to Genesis 6, where the story or the account of Noah and the flood happens, it actually begins with the curse of the dirt. Now, most people don't catch it because it actually happens in the genealogy right before there. But it says his father names him, Lamech names him Noah, because he's going to bring relief from the curse of the dirt. So you go into the flood story knowing that this is going to bring relief from the curse of the dirt. At the tail end of the flood story, Noah comes off the ark. He offers a sacrifice, seemingly of thankfulness. And God's response is, I will never curse the dirt again, even though the intent of humans' thoughts are evil continually. So the problem of human wickedness does not go away at all. God acknowledges that's going to continue, but I'm not going to curse the dirt anymore. So it seems that they were in this super cursed period where it's dire. It's worse than they seem to be imagining a world in which it's much worse than it is for us today when it comes to creating calories. And what is the notable feature of that world? Wickedness and violence and the ruining of the dirt. So they're connecting together side by side, scarcity and violence, the kind of violence that's so endemic and pervasive that God's only solution is to wipe it out with watery violence and kind of start over again with one guy, even though he acknowledges, again, the wickedness that produced the violence in the first place is not gone. That's still here, but he's not going to curse the dirt. And then from that point on, you can just kind of truck on through with the question of where is scarcity an issue? And also like Babel, right? I had never thought about it before until I started researching it. But little lines like, this is Ham's descendants who go east and into the plains of Shinar and stop there and build a city. You're like, I remember thinking when I was researching this, wait, why did they stop in the plains of Shinar? I never actually thought about that before. So I spent a few days just looking up the agriculture of the plains of Shinar in the Bronze Age. And it's a very, anybody who knew that region would have known, they can tell you exactly why they stopped there. It's lush and fertile. It's one of the, it's one of the most fertile parts of the Fertile Crescent, which probably had a lot to do with why they stopped there to set up shop and say, hey, we can control agriculture here. I also point out that when God takes Israel out of Egypt, he drops them in the only non-fertile part of the Fertile Crescent and says, I will send the water, I will make everything fertile. And the local gods are fertility gods. So I usually challenge people, hey, can anybody name the fertility gods of Egypt or Mesopotamia? And they usually cannot, because fertility is not such a big deal in Mesopotamia and Egypt because you have these massive rivers flowing there. But when you get into Canaan, every god is a fertility god, from Moloch to Dagon, the Philistines on the west side, to Baal, and et cetera. So when you hear fertility, you hear it's a fertility god, what you're really talking about is, can you grow enough food? And do you need gods, or gods bring the rain that control the food and the flocks, et cetera? And so I don't think it's an overshot to say that most of the Bible is about water and fertility. That's driving a lot of the story forward. And when water and fertility dry up, violence seems to be a natural outcome that's associated with it. I don't think they ever make direct causal links, but they associate violence with scarcity, which tells me, and lots of people have throughout history. So it tells me that's not a crazy thing to do. Yeah.
And you do kind of play in those chapters on the irony that, like you said before, and I'd never noticed this before, but it makes perfect sense. They call Canaan the land of milk and honey, but it's one of the least fertile places in the entire world. And I think one of the points you make is that that's because Israel actually has to trust in God to provide them with what they need to survive. So maybe talk about that for a minute too. How does God help the people of Israel overcome, to a certain extent, the problem, or how could he have had they been faithful to the covenant?
Yeah, so fertility is connected to how much they keep justice in the land. So this is one of the, you talk about a place that has to necessarily conflict with Darwinist thought or evolutionary science, or most of it at least, is the way you make the ground fertile in ancient Israel is you maintain justice. You don't exploit the vulnerable in all the different ways. Exploit foreigners, orphans, widows, accuse people falsely of crimes they didn't commit, all the kinds of ways in which you can exploit people. I don't think there's any world in which we're going to be able to say, oh yeah, evolutionary theory accounts for this. It is a very different way of thinking about the world. So God promises, I will bring the rains if you we say keep the covenant. The phrase shamar, keep, it means like to tend to shepherd. So that's what they're supposed to become, this kind of people. And I would argue, if you look at the long scope, they're supposed to become this kind of people, not for themselves, but for the sake of the world. It's for all the families of the earth. So as much as they fail to do this, they hurt other people that it was supposed to be a blessing to, in the language of Genesis 12. So this direct connection between their moral behavior and the dirt, and how many calories the dirt is going to produce, if we can just put it in mechanical terms, is open and obvious in the Torah, the books of Moses. All the prophets think this is obvious. I mean, you get this test me and see. Like, why do you think the fields have not produced food? It's because you're exploiting the poor, right? So this is not just a little boutique idea that shows up with Moses. This continues all the way through. And so we don't find it at all surprising that Jesus is deriding people for doing the same kinds of things. And also showing his power over the waters and the meteorology of the land when he shows up as well. So anyways, yeah, I could go on and on about the fertility scarcity issue, but the connection to morality, I think, is the one that's most important to keep in mind. And that starts with Cain and Abel. When Cain kills Abel, it's the dirt that cries out. His blood cries out from the dirt to which it was shed. So that connection between violence and the dirt and fertility, it's all being mixed together there in Genesis 1 through 11.
The second Darwinian category that you talk about in your book is the idea of fitness. And as I was telling you before the show, I'm a social studies teacher. I am not a science guy.
Oh.
So there's a lot of these concepts are, you've heard of them before, but a lot of these concepts I could not explain to other educated adults. You have a really excellent analogy when you are trying to explain fitness to your audience with the life of the Apostle Paul, where you look at his social environment. So I want you to walk us through that analogy, because I think it's such an important analogy, and it was just a really great way of explaining fitness, and then also talk about how that category works within Darwinian thinking.
I think that it's been a while. The Apostle Paul one is that Paul is kind of a little bit of everywhere he's been. Yeah. It was a weird one to draw upon, but it made so much sense to me at the time, because there's this big debate about what animates Paul's thinking, like what's the center of his thinking, right? And I think it's kind of a fool's errand, but scholars love to trying to nail things down to just one thing, right? And then you had some Paul scholars who stepped back, and senior scholars who's like, you know what, Paul's a little bit of everywhere he's been. And as I was reading the kind of the stuff on, especially not biology, but not on fungus or virus, but on I'm losing the word, bacteria, right? It turns out that if you wanted to figure out the best fingerprint of you or me is not our fingerprints, it's not the way we walk, it's not our DNA. The most accurate fingerprint of you or my eye would be for someone to take our gut bacteria, and they could tell you every place. If we had a map of these things like the genome, we could say every playground you've ever played on when you were a child, every country you've ever visited, we could basically map out your biography by the bacteria that are in your gut right now, which means that we're all a little bit a part of, and of course, our bacteria in our gut outnumbers our human body cells like 3-1 or something like that. So we're, by the numbers, we're more bacteria than we are human. But that's just evidence that we are all like fitted in some way or dragging forward all the things that we've experienced, including our viruses. Viruses we've experienced get edited and cut into our DNA, which is one of the reasons why we can't do, DNA archaeology. You can only see so many generations past back into the DNA because of viral editing. It kind of creates a cloudy blur where you go back too far, you can't see anymore in the DNA. So that this idea of fit, I always thought of it exclusively as like what animal fits into that cave the best, right? Which is part of that's what Darwin says about fit. What they call niche habitat and fit today in evolutionary thinking, it actually goes down to the cellular, maybe even the molecular level of how animals and I would say even trees. I think I had a little bit in there about how trees might communicate with each other using fungal networks, and that's all very interesting. But what's actually happening when you have different trees of different species that talk to each other, and I'm using scare quotes to say talk to each other, you're really talking about how do groups of created things stay in the place they are and live and avoid scarcity in proper ways together. So again, scarcity and fit are connected together, intertangled. I mean, in some ways, this is an artificial disentangling of things that all are intertangled together, like a 3-corded strand or something like that. So fit and scarcity are directly related in this way, in a way that sexual propagation and scarcity and fit are not.
Well, your chapter, and I wrote the chapter title down here, your chapter that covers fitness in the Bible is very ambitious. It's called Fit and Dislocation from Garden to New Earth. So it's like the entire sweep of the biblical narrative. So I was very impressed that you were able to pull that off in one chapter. But what does the Bible tell us about fitness?
Yeah, so this is the interesting story. And it's when I started thinking of dislocation, that's actually when it connected for me, is when the man and the woman no longer fit the garden. You say, well, what happened? And again, this is where the moral category gets connected to the physical category. Because you listened to the serpent by listening to his wife, they no longer fit to they weren't properly fit to the environment. The only option is for them to be exiled. They go east. There's a heavenly creature, a cherubim there that protects the way so they can't come back into the garden. Same thing with Cain. He murders his brother. He has to wander. He's no longer fit to staying put and growing crops. He has to wander, which means, and I always have to point out, because somebody pointed out to me once that if it was flipped and Abel was the one who killed Cain, wandering would not be a punishment. He's a shepherd. He can wander all day and all night, and that's what they do for a living. It actually is an advantage for him. So it's that punishment is curated for Cain, that he has to wander and therefore no longer fits. Obviously, when you get into later history of Israel, the Canaanites, all the different tribes and people groups in the Canaanites no longer fit into the land, and God calls Israel to drive them out. It says the land's going to vomit them out. Why? Because of all these sexual crimes, exploitation, the violence and wickedness against the weak and the vulnerable makes them no longer fit the land, and Israel drives them out. But as Israel is meant to drive them out, God is warning them the whole time. But if you do these things, I'm going to come kill you all too. You're not going to fit into the land as well. And eventually he pulls the trigger on that with the northern nation of Israel, and then the southern nation of Judah follows in suit as well. And then there's a return to the land. And when you look at Ezra and Nehemiah, I don't know if I talked about it this much in this chapter, but when they return to the land after that they've been dislocated from because they no longer fit, there's a heavy emphasis on, hey, we can't do this because this is the very thing that got us dislocated in the first place. This is the very thing that made us not fit this land anymore. And of course, Jesus carries this out as well. I always have to point to how Jesus does this as well, because he's a very savvy Torah thinker. I mean, no surprise there, I guess, if he's the Son of God. But he does, in many ways, kind of breathe a lot of the logic and thinking there. So when the Sadducees approach him, this is my favorite interaction about marriage. They give him a marriage logic puzzle. Like, this woman's married to lots of guys. Who is she married to in the age of resurrection? He flips the logic on them, and he basically says, "Are you guys even fit for the age of resurrection? Like, you guys aren't fit for it. Like, you're not going to be able to be fitted into that time and space." So this and of course the judgment day is categorized as a massive, like, who fits after the age of resurrection, who doesn't, according to their moral behavior, exploitation, etc. So it runs from front to back.
Yeah, the third category that you talk about is generation. And this is a really complicated one because when you think about generation, or at least from an evolutionary perspective, you make the argument that generation is different than the way that we understand kind of like procreation or copulation, that generation is a much larger category. And you also explain that within the theory of natural selection, like monogamy, which is a Christian value, does not make a lot of sense. So explain to us what generation means and how that's distinguished from other ways of thinking about reproduction and sexuality.
Yeah, so we can think about, and of course the biblical authors talk about all of these pretty openly, unashamedly. We can think about just sexual behavior, which is different than procreation. And procreation just means obviously having children. But what emerges early on in Genesis is it's not just about having children. It's actually about having descendants who live long in the land. And so I think of it in the sense of procreation is concerned with my children, and generation, as I call it, or propagation is often the term used in evolutionary thinking. Generational thinking is more thinking about my great-great-great-grandchildren who I will never know, never see. What is their life going to be like? How are they going to fit in the land and stay here? And so what you find is that in evolutionary thought, it's mostly, for all the reasons that make sense, it's almost entirely concerned with sexual acts. And I say sexual acts from procreation because some sex acts are like non-procreational. Some same-sex, in the animal kingdom, you get same-sex acts that are there's no way two men or two women are going to procreate. But you still get sex acts that play a role in different creatures' lives. So dolphins and bonobo chimpanzees, which I talk about. Everybody talks about bonobos because of their crazy sex lives that are not procreative. And then you have mating, which is procreative. But really, there's no way, I don't know how we would ever know that. I doubt that there's a single animal who's thinking about their great-great-grandchildren or their great-great-great-great-grandchildren, right? So that is something that is uniquely human. And there's nothing natural in the same way that there's nothing natural about a 7-day week. A day is a solar event. A week is a month is a lunar event. A year is a solar event. You can tie these to the celestial bodies. There's nothing that is 7-day long in creation. There's nothing that's tied to it. It's an artificial period of time. In the same way, monogamy seems to be completely artificial. It doesn't fit to any of the instincts of animals. And in fact, it seems to go against them. But interestingly, even in animal studies, primates, but also like dolphins and, mammals of all kinds, when the male not only procreates, but stays around and helps to raise the children, that has all kinds of benefits for the health and welfare of those children that are just quite simply, they're unknowable to the person who's involved at the time. Like there's no way, even I'm married 26 years, I stayed and I helped raise my kids, right? That makes it sound like it was my wife's job and I just helped, right? As I believe we were supposed to do. But there's no way I could have anticipated the various benefits that would have for my children. So there is we are approaching the kind of uniquely human side of, or hominid side at least, of evolution. That you see reflected in Scripture.
Yeah. So Darwin focuses, obviously, and people that adhere to natural selection focus on generation. That's kind of like the big picture, long-term goal. And you argue, too, and this was very interesting, that in Genesis, the presentation of sex that we get in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 actually has very little to do with procreation and more to do with both copulation and then also generation, that those are the two concerns that are built into that. So walk us through that a little bit, because, again, obviously, both Jesus and Paul in the New Testament refer back to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 when they're talking about sexual ethics and marriage and things like that. So it's a very important foundation for understanding how the Bible perceives that issue. What's going on there?
With sexual differentiation?
Well, yeah, just the way that's understood in Genesis in the earliest chapters.
Yeah. So, and this was the scandal for me that I just didn't know. Just the idea that you have male and female is like, for biologists, they believe this is where evolution went wrong. Like male and female sexes is not a good thing. It's onerous. It's inefficient. It causes lots of death for all kinds of reasons. So if evolution had gone correctly, it would have been non-sexual. It would have been asexual. There's no reason why you and I couldn't sexually reproduce, given some reorienting of our the way the biology works. And so you have that, and at the beginning of Genesis, you have the image of God as male and female. So it puts biological female and male right there at the center. I shouldn't say biological because it's not biological with God, but there's something about maleness and femaleness right there at the center. And then, God blesses not just humans, but all the animals to be fruitful and multiply. And that phrase actually does not, although it sounds very biblical to us, it only occurs in a few key places throughout Scripture. And so the goal here is actually to create generations of generations and fill the earth and actually move out into different parts of the land. And we see with Babel, that's part of the problem, is they're not moving out, they're staying put. And God moves them out. It's not even a curse. It's just a natural consequence of them failing to move. So it's unclear. Our theologians have to do the work to figure out like why God wants people to spread out in these various ways. But this is the goal here. It's never focused, and I mean, if I could put it in modern American terms, what you see no focus on is the nuclear family, like me, my spouse, and our children. And if you just think, and there's been a lot of critique of the American ideal of the nuclear family, so I don't need to pile onto that critique. But if you think about the thinking that goes behind that, right, is it's about me and mine and my family and protecting mine. So your in-laws become the enemy. Your parents can even be meddling, right? And then you're meddling with your grandchildren or whatever, versus really thinking about that. So now when you start talking about third and fourth and fifth generation thinking of generational thinking, the way you build your house is going to be different because you're going to be thinking about who's going to live in this house after I'm dead and gone. I don't blink for a moment and think about who's going to live in my house right now when I'm dead and gone, because I'm going to sell it probably here in a few years and move somewhere else, right? So even the sexual difference in generation like bleeds into all kinds of thinking about family planning, city planning, what societies can look like, etc. So there's just this overall very different view, and then. And by the time you get to the New Testament, it becomes a metaphor for making disciples as well, right? So they believe you should still be having children and all that kind of stuff. And I know people sometimes read Paul and the one statement of saying, hey, everybody should be single and just die single and go to work for Jesus. But I think when you read all of Paul, you realize he has a very Hebrew view of sex and generation, that people should generally do it. There are some cases where they should think of God's calling them to do something differently. But it does become kind of an analogy for how God wants to expand the kingdom of his disciples as well. So it's kind of sewn, like everything else, it's kind of sewn into everything that they're doing. And everybody wants to live long in the land. And typically what they mean by that, like when the Psalms cry out, do not cut me off from the face of the land, what they typically mean is let my children, don't let me die childless, and let my children continue to live in this land and worship God. And that's what actually living long in the land seems to entail for them as well. Just you think about the modern American dream, so different than what we're used to thinking about.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Well, your final chapter is entitled Through Two Glasses Darkly, and it looks at the impact that your work trying to identify the overlaps between natural selection and the Bible have on our understanding of eschatology. So what does this study tell us about the end and what's going to happen next?
Yeah, so that was the longest chapter too, and it was because I was trying to work it out shortly. I mean, basically, I try to say here, and I say this, I'm a Hebrew Bible scholar. That's like my bread and butter, as I work in the Hebrew Bible and teach it. And even as somebody who reads that literature a lot, I feel like when they talk about creation and when they talk about the new heavens and new earth, they kind of put it off in mysterious categories of we don't know exactly what the creation was like. Like where the man and the woman having sex in the garden, I don't know, it's unclear, right? Were they eating? What was their diet like? How long of walks did they take together? Like, we don't know much about it. It's 2 chapters for the entire cosmos and creation. And similarly, you get very limited little peeks into the future. And Paul even says, we can't really, you can conceive of it, but you can't even imagine what this new heavens, new earth resurrection body is going to be like. And Jesus, obviously, we get some glimpses of resurrected body. He's unrecognizable until God opens your eyes so that you can see who it is, right? But we're stuck in the now when everything's kind of bent and disoriented and not the way it's supposed to be. So I did include a little bit in there. And of course, the publishers got very nervous when I said, I want to talk about psychedelics and using psychedelics in here. As somebody who used psychedelics in the 80s, I would have been nervous as well.
Yeah, well, hey, this is a libertarian podcast, by the way, so there's no.
Oh, yeah, they don't care. Yeah. Psychedelics can be very dangerous things, right? And so, but it was one of, I actually had a whole spate of things that I wanted to talk about, but I ended up just cutting it short. Is if it is true that like the present cosmos just needs to be reoriented and put fully under the reign of God, like at every granularity and level, then we should see indications of that. Like we should look around the world and we should be able to see indications of what that might look like. There's a great book by Cornelius Benham, or what's his last name? Oh, I can't remember his name. Neil Plantinga. Sorry, Cornelius Plantinga, the brother of Alvin Plantinga, if you know him. Called Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, a Breviary on Sin, where he tries to imagine how the current corrupted world might look if it's reoriented the way it's supposed to be. It's a great book at building the imagination of these things. Psychedelics is one of those very simple, easy life extension programs. I think was the other one I used in the book, where it's like, students ask me every year when I teach Noah, and they're like, they says they live for 900 years, but that's impossible. I'm like, actually, biologist friends, like not even Christians, like just normal biologists and geneticists who I know, they say, yeah, no, that's completely doable. That's like not biologically impossible at all. If your DNA were arranged, or they think right now, if your DNA were structured slightly differently, you would just be a 25-year-old for your entire, until a train hit you or whatever. Accidents can still happen. But psychedelics was one of those, the psychedelic feeling of being connected to nature, being connected to other humans, being kind to other people, the kind of feeling that a lot of people get from various psychedelics. That's actually a switch that's already in your brain. Psychedelics don't like flood your brain and make connections. They just turn a switch on that's already there and let your brain do the rest, or let your being do the rest. And as I say in the book, this is not an endorsement at all for using psychedelics. I just want to be clear, because again, I do think they can be very dangerous. But that to me is, if we looked in the world and can find no evidence whatsoever what a reoriented world, properly oriented world looks like, then I think we should start questioning some things and say, maybe that's not, or maybe the biblical authors were off, or maybe this isn't going to work out. But everything I looked into, I was like, oh yeah, there is a way in which cancer cells can be turned so that they go back to human body cells. Like there's a way in which that can happen biologically, which to me is an affirmation that the created world is that God wasn't joking when he said this is real and good, or when he says it's good and very good. And that God doesn't throw away, he redeems, he restores, he recreates. It's a renewed heavens and earth, not a brand new heavens and earth. So I think those points cohere with what we see in the biblical story of humanity from beginning to end. That also is where I find the greatest conflict with the evolutionary story as well. Is that long story? The world used to be one way, is now this other corrupted way, and is going to get turned to right. That creates a difficulty with trying to just jam evolution in there and go, and God used evolution to create everything, right? Or the sexual issue that I didn't know it until I was researching this book, that most evolutionary biologists believe that almost all hominids were evolved through what they call forced copulation, or sexual assault is what we would call it. So when I hear a theistic evolutionist colleague say, oh, God used this tool of evolution to finally craft humans and get them where he wants, I'm like, I'm not sure if you're taking on board everything that's involved with that finely crafted tool, right? So those are what I think I call them the more profound conflicts than that superficial science versus religion, evolution versus 7-day creation. Like they're actually deeper problems there that I couldn't personally work out in my own brain. Maybe somebody else will have worked them out, and I'll be happy to read that. So.
Yeah, I would like, kind of to wrap this all up, I would like to get your perspective on the creation evolution debate here too, because I do think that this is an alternative way of trying to frame that. And for me, I live in Northern Kentucky. I've grown up here my entire life, and the Creation Museum, Ken Ham's Creation Museum, is like 5 minutes from my childhood home where my parents still live.
Wow.
And I remember they opened that up, I think when I was in I was in college, or maybe like a senior in high school when they started. I don't know. But so for me in Northern Kentucky, the creation evolution debates are very hot, because obviously Ken Ham has an extremely conservative understanding of what's going on in Genesis. But it was very apparent to me when I went to Bible college and I started studying the Old Testament, and again, going back to the fact that the ancients had a completely different conceptual world than us in the modern world, that the creation evolution debate was just framed entirely the wrong way. I just felt like they weren't even trying to address the issues that Genesis was actually trying to explain to us. So I think you did a really good job of kind of opening up that conversation. So based on your research, how should we think about that debate? Because it is a very polarizing debate in our society, but I think that there are just better ways of looking at it. And I think that you're touching up on something that might help people reframe their understanding of what's going on with the Bible and how that relates to how we do modern science.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I have my own way of of dealing with these issues, but what I tried to do in this book is what I try to do in life on a good day. Is I tried to value everybody's voices more rather than like create straw men to knock down, or I don't know. Some people may think I have straw men here, but I really wanted to listen to say like, hey, Darwin was no fool. He was actually pretty brilliant, and he was very. I mean, let's just face it. Darwin was paying more attention to creation than almost anybody in these debates, right? Outside of some of the scientists who are doing similar things. He was very tuned into the way the world worked, and he was he was doing what God created him to do, try to figure out, okay, I've got these puzzles. How did this stuff happen? I mean, he's not being anti-God or irreligious. He's actually doing exactly what God created him to do. And he's got the mind and the history and the biography to do the very thing that he's doing. And the same thing with the biblical authors. They actually have special insights into the nature of the universe, and they speak in such a way, they write in such a way that is not the way we're used to thinking through things today, but they have a way, if you'll listen to them, they'll tell you what they think, and they'll repeat it over and over and over in theme and variation so that you can hear it kind of come to the fore. And so that was my way, is basically valuing everybody's voice, amplifying their voices, and then seeing, once you turn them up above the ground clutter or the noise floor, then you can kind of see what the actual differences are. And I called that an apples to apples approach, because I feel like a lot of the debate, and I'm not going to even call it debate because it's people just talking past one another. It's people not actually trying. And this is not true. There are some people who are really trying to understand each other and have really in-depth debates at the right level. But the kind of popular level church debates, it's more like jujitsu, and here's my enemy, and my goal is to take him down, and that all means, right? I bought a book the other day. It's called the Counter Creation Apologetics book. It's put out by the University of California Press, like it's an academic press, and it's an apologetics book in reverse, saying here's what the creationist says, and here's what you should say, right? And I'm just like, it's interesting, and I'm really enjoying it. But it's like fight fire with fire kind of thing. And so I think it's a lot of people honestly talking past each other, and say, well, Darwin believed we come from monkeys. And I'm like, no, he did not. Like, that's just an indicator that you're not listening to the other person. So it's not that the debate is in a bad place. It's that most people just aren't valuing the voices and the thoughts and the humanity of the people in the debate. And where they are doing it, it's quiet and it's subtle and it's nuanced and it takes some time to think about it. I would just say that I'm not a scientist. I'm not a trained scientist. I was going to go into science at one point and then switch to seminary instead. But I mean, who am I? And you notice I don't do it in the book. Like, who am I to evaluate some of these scientific principles and theories? It's not my specialty. I do philosophy of science. But I don't know enough about the data to make a lot of these calls, and everything's growing at such an exponential rate. So I have friends who are in the sciences who I trust. I know how they think about the world, and I seek their input, and they tell me what's good and what's not, and where people are really onto something and where they're really missing the mark. And that's really helpful. It's all led me to be a little bit more agnostic about everything and hold everything with kind of like a more open hand. And to say, like, whatever the biblical authors think, like, I would think it would be a clear swing and a miss if the biblical authors are wrong, that the universe, upon the return of Jesus, that the universe is not going to be some way fundamentally altered into some better estate, right? And that there's no signs of that today. But outside of that, I'm open to all the explanations. Anything that sounds coherent, I'm open for it. But I don't presume that I'm going to be able to figure it all out by myself. And I think that's an incredibly hubristic way to come into the conversation. I've got this figured out. This person's talking nonsense. Now let me give you 5 arguments as to why, why they're wrong. Like, I just don't know that that's productive in any conversation, whether that's you and your spouse talking about how to raise your kids or evolution or anything, sexuality, like that's just not productive. So, and if agnosticism is the end goal, that people read this book and they're like, I don't really know what I think about the book or the things it's talking about. That's fine. Like, I trust God can work that all. That's a trajectory. I keep telling people this book is only meant to be a start to a conversation I didn't see people having. It is in no way the end of the conversation or definitive conclusion about the topic.
Man, I love that answer. Dr. Dru Johnson, this has been a great conversation. Before I let you go today, where can people find and follow you?
Well, if they have to, I'm on Twitter, but I have a web page, like all the publishers want you to have. So drujohnson.com, DRU Johnson, because I'm weird, right? I have to do everything differently. But yeah, if they're interested.
Yeah. Well, I will put links to everything on the show notes and, of course, links to the great book. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for coming on the show today.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.